Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways. Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, and a very special guest to be revealed. And today we're going to look in depth at an extraordinary part of the effort in the Second World War. And we'll get to this, that is either romanticised or written off, that is seen as simultaneously this sort of tales of heroism and romantic glamorous tales, or, well, they didn't achieve anything, it's not really important, you know, if you factor it into the bigger picture, it doesn't really add anything. Precisely. And that subject, we're calling it Krystyna and Co.
Yes,
aren't we?
subtitle, SOE, female agents.
And we're joined by, well, I mean, the expert, I think it's fair to say.
Thank you very much.
Clare Mulley. Welcome, Clare.
Great friend of the show.
Great friend of the show.
And indeed, great friend of We Have Ways Fest.
Absolutely. And your book, Agent Zoe, last year...
was absolutely fantastic.
It's a fantastic
Thank you.
book.
Out in paperback this year.
I
put it down as one of my books of the year for BBC History Magazine.
Oh, fantastic. I didn't clock that. Brilliant. I should tweet it.
And at We Have Ways Fest, some friends came and I said, well, go and see that. You'll probably enjoy that. And they basically came back from your talk slack-jawed with astonishment. They'd never imagined that there could be a woman like her.
And there were many of her.
Exactly. And the things she'd done and how her life was this sort of... I mean, if you made it up, you'd be laughed out of town, wouldn't you?
That's why I don't write novels, because people wouldn't believe it. But yeah, we should all know this history.
Yeah. And it's Krystyna Skarbek, why we've called it Krystyna and Co. It's sort of the doorway into this subject, or our drawbridge, as it were. I mean, just give us
this amazing woman.
Absolutely incredible woman. Without hesitation, deviation or repetition. Just a minute on Krystyna Skarbek.
Well, we were talking about being the originals, you know, the originals of the SAS the other day. She is the original.
She is first woman to serve Britain as a special agent, even before SOE was established, and actually the longest serving special agent, male or female, for Britain during the Second World War.
Sure.
Yeah, indeed. 6 years.
Extraordinary.
She was banging on the door of SIS MI6 in 1939.
Sure.
Not so much volunteering as demanding to be taken on.
Yeah.
And of course, the young men in there, and they were all young men, just laughed at her.
Okay, but what's her motivation for that?
Well, she's Polish-born, Krystyna Skarbek, or Christine
But she's living in England, is she,
Granville.
by this point?
No, she was actually then married to her second husband, who was a diplomat in southern Africa, when they heard the news of the outbreak. So they turned around to come back to serve their nation, Poland, but they had to come back with wartime conditions very slowly in convoy around sort of possible submarine areas.
Yep.
So by the time they got back, Poland, of course, never capitulated, but had fallen and been occupied and divided. And so she felt that the fastest way she could join the Allied effort was to volunteer for the British Special Forces. So there she is demanding to be taken on, and they just laugh at her because she's not British. And above all, she's a woman, and there are no women doing this work. But she's just too good to be turned down.
How does she know which doorbell to ring to go and see SIS?
Well, I mean, she'd done a bit of journalism before the war, and she definitely was moving in those circles in
So
Poland and internationally. Yeah, she'd been in Paris. Her husband was a well-known diplomat. So, yeah, she had contacts. We don't entirely know, but we know some people who could have put her
adjacent
in touch.
Enough.
Exactly.
And after all, journalism, diplomacy...
There is some interface.
Lots of people double-hatting in those, both those worlds, yeah.
So because she served directly for Britain during the Second World War, most of her papers are in the National Archives at Kew. And the first memo in there is really fantastic. It's these young men who describe her as expert skier, a great adventuress, and absolutely fearless. But what I loved is one of them had penciled in the margin, but she terrifies me. So that gives you an idea of her character. And despite everything, she was a gift horse. They couldn't look in the mouth. She had the right contacts. She spoke the right languages. And she knew secret routes in and out of occupied Poland because, as a rather bored countess when she was married to her first husband, actually, she used to smuggle cigarettes by skiing over the high Tatra mountains in and out. And actually, she didn't even smoke. She was one of the few women in 1930s Europe who didn't smoke. She just did it for kicks, just for the thrill of it. But it meant she knew the smuggling routes in and out of the mountains.
So in February 1941, for instance, she's taken taking microfilm.
Yeah, she served in 3 different theatres of the war. So this is the first one. She is serving as sort of working in intelligence and as a courier.
Yeah.
She made the first contact between Britain and the fledgling resistance in Poland, which of course is the first occupied nation. So Britain's desperate to find out what's going on in the country. So she skis in, gets rid of her skis, and then she goes around the country. She makes contact with the resistance. She collects information from them, but she also undertakes her own intelligence going around the country, seeing where troop movements are and so on, and then takes microfilm and other material, first coding information so we could establish radio contact with the Polish resistance, skis back over the mountains to Budapest, where she's based, and hands it over to both Polish and British resistance contacts. So she's remarkable.
Can we just sort of go back a bit? Because she's arrived in London in 1939, the back end of 1939, says, you need to take me on. And they eventually say, yes, OK, fine.
Yep.
Then what? I mean, she's got to have training.
No, well, she's trained later on. She's trained in 41.
She's volunteered to MI6, SAS.
That's right.
So she's been taken on by SAS.
So they do give her a false identity. She's sent to Budapest and she's meant to be a French journalist. I mean, among her language skills, she's completely fluent in French. And that's not unusual. Hungary hasn't fallen yet. There's lots of international journalists based there seeing what's going on in Eastern Europe. So she's sent out there, and from there she independently goes across the mountains. So she does make contact with the fledgling Polish resistance. The first time she skied in is actually with the pre-war Olympic Polish skiing champion, which is quite handy. And then when she comes back, she makes contact with the man, Andrew Kowarski, who becomes one of her main partners in the war, who's a one-legged veteran. He's got a prosthetic, one wooden leg, which is quite useful, actually, because he whittled a hole in it and would hide information
hide stuff in his leg.
Yeah.
These
this is why I don't write novels. You know?
Yeah. We just touched on it a moment ago, that SOE, the creation of SOE, and she predates this, but this is really the sort of significant thing that happens in British efforts to famously set Europe ablaze. I mean, we're doing a podcast about secret agents, about SOE. We have to say set Europe ablaze, or we'll be run out of town, won't we? We have to use
the famous Churchill phrase.
Get through that bit.
Yeah, I mean, and this is really, really important, isn't it? Because when we've talked about SIS here, but here's an actually separate organisation being set up quite deliberately.
Partly under the wing of SAS, even though there was huge problems between them.
Well, yes, I mean, it's sort of Venn diagram. They sort of phase in and out of one another as the war runs. And
right.
Is SOE under SIS's purview? Or
it wasn't, but it was partly from SIS, partly from Section D, D for destruction, which is, Big Bang sabotage, which is partly why SAS, of course, which is silent intelligence, didn't get on with them.
Yeah,
and Electra House, so intelligence work
But
as
it's
well.
Dancy, who's the second in command of MI6. I mean, he's got his hands all over SOE, hasn't he?
Yeah, like you say, a Venn diagram, but problematic as well, especially as things move on.
Yeah. And I suppose if you're on the ground in France, a resistor in France, and someone turns up and says, I'm here to help you, SIS, SOE, what does it matter if you're on
Well, it did matter, but less on those terms, more in terms of, are you a de Gaulleist supporter, are you a communist or whatever.
Exactly.
But, there is coordination. Thank you, Jean Moulin. So,
Yeah. Okay, so that's July 1940, and really, this is because what options does Britain actually have in
on ground.
In mainland Europe, on the ground,
Naval point, you've got all sorts of options.
And of course it's July 40 because France has fallen.
Yes.
And so there are these budding resistance organisations and we want to be able to support them in various ways. So this is how we do it.
Yeah, there's training in there's sort of selection, training, parachute training. I mean, it's an exhaustive sort of process if you are selected.
It is.
But how are you selected? Because I think it's really quite interesting who ends up in SOE. So obviously, SOE is established and it's proper secret agent stuff as people might imagine, isn't it? You're trained to live on the land, you're trained in explosives, you're trained in
Morse,
in all this parachuting. And I mean, one of the things you get with people's descriptions of going to Ringway in airborne forces is there's always someone there, there's a woman there who's parachuting. So there's all these hairy-ass paratroopers, and then there'll be some guy in a suit or a woman, and they're thinking, "Who the hell's that? Why are they learning to parachute?"
Yeah, but my understanding is that they don't have. There's not a big emphasis on female agents to start off with, because it's not until after the obligatory work service thing that comes in 42, I remember, June 42. Then there's no men. So how can you justify having young men agents around the place? Because if they were there, they should be in Germany doing labour. So that's the point about having female agents.
But that's the thing is, that's a utilitarian argument for using women, isn't it? Is that they're the most suited to the set of circumstances you've got. But that doesn't stop all sorts of sexist resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was huge resistance right from the start from using women in the front line. In fact, women were banned from serving in the armed forces using weapons. So women couldn't bear arms in the British Armed Forces at the start of the war, in fact, through the war. So, and yeah, there's this sort of very profound gender belief that war is male and that women shouldn't have a role.
Well, to be fair, that's only changed in this country in the last, 15
Yeah, we are getting there. Under Cameron, he did quite a lot of forwarding that.
Yeah.
But we are still getting there, but we need to take a retrospective look at the history, I think. So, yeah, I mean, women were very much disempowered. They were told they didn't qualify for active service. They didn't have the required strength. They might be a liability and distract the men who might be chivalrous towards them in the field.
I do find that
all
that's
of
the idea that she's just too delicious to be around. I can't concentrate on my Morse code.
It's partly that, and it's partly that chivalrous idea that, there's danger. Instead of doing my role, I'll go and rescue her first.
Yeah.
It's that kind of fear. But also I've seen in the files just sanitary issues, i.e. what if they're on a period? That sort of thing. But, actually they can deal with it. And the women had to fight against that sexism all the way through, even after they are being recruited, all the way through selection, through training. So if you look at the training reports, there's lots of reports that talk about the feminine qualities of the women. They say they're lacking in guile or they're very innocent. Yeah. So Vera Atkins, who was actually helping with the male and female SOE agents, often thought that she only managed
what
the
an amazing
women,
woman she was, by the way.
We'll get to her, yeah.
But yeah, she very much believed that the male officers, when they said these comments, just meant that the women shouldn't be here at all, shouldn't be serving behind enemy lines. The Poles, of course, got their, after the fall of France, their headquarters, their government and their command of their armed forces all came to London. And again, they were doing their training here through SOE. And they were, again, reporting that these women had very considerable feminine charm, and some of them were praised for feigning innocence and helpless ignorance. I guess that could be quite useful in the field.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, they say if it wasn't for the possible disadvantage of their sex, she would be a grade A. So they're fighting all the way.
Yeah. The thing is I imagine... this we are talking about a long time ago, but these are sort of profound ways of looking at the world, aren't they? These ingrained sexist ways of looking at the world.
Absolutely.
And the depth of the emergency that the country finds itself in, and people are still hanging on to that. I think it's really
the irony is that this is part of what makes them so effective, because that ingrained sexism is also in Germany, is also in enemy nations, and particularly perhaps in the misogynistic Third Reich.
Yeah.
And so this is partly what gives these women an advantage.
Yeah.
So they are underestimated, they are overlooked.
Yeah, yeah. And how are they recruiting them? Because I think it's a really interesting sort of... it's not scientific, is it? They don't put an ad in the Evening Standard.
Does anyone want to be a spy?
It's not like that, because MI6 do advertise now, don't they?
Yeah, they did. They were recruited the same way the men are recruited. So a lot of it, most of it, is through referral through the other armed forces. So, for example, women like Noor are very good at wireless transmitting, serving with the WAF, then get transferred over. Or if they have language skills and they're in the ATS or something, they may get transferred over to SOE to be
So that'll be a memo goes round going, if there's anyone who's particularly good at WT, could you let us know?
Yeah, exactly. So they're looking for these specific skills and not specifying male or female. So a lot of it, same with the men actually, was through serendipity or word of mouth as well. So you get some great stories like Odette Sansom. She responded to an Admiralty request in the run-up to Normandy. Yeah. And they wanted photographs of the French coastline, postcards, anything to give them a better idea of the details that the men might find. And she sent hers, not to the Admiralty, by mistake, she sent hers to the War Office, who immediately thought, OK, this woman has the detailed knowledge. She's got all these photographs of her on the beach all over the North French coast. And so they brought her in for an interview. Or another example is just Yvonne Ruddelat, one of the first women to go in. She happened to be working at the bar where Selwyn Jepson, the main recruiting officer for SOE, liked to go for a drink. And he heard her speaking French and had a chat with her.
That's incredible.
Your country needs you, my dear.
It's absolutely incredible.
But, a
vodka martini, please, and your country needs you.
Well, exactly. This happened with the men as well, but this is how it works.
I think you could be rather useful.
So, yeah.
Extraordinary. And then they're background checked.
Yeah, MI5 would look for, no trace is their phrase. That meant they're good to go through. And then they'd have to sign the Official Secrets Act, even before they found out what the work entailed or what the job was. It's that secret.
Isn't it? Yeah. And then they're put into the fanny. And,
sent off to Lily-Whites first.
Yes, obviously.
For their fanny uniform. So, yeah, I love the fact they're sent off to Lily-Whites for their hard serge uniform. So the fanny, the first aid nursing yeomanry, very important because they still exist, Britain's only uniform group outside of the structures of the British Armed Forces, which meant that then they could bear arms. And hopefully,
Is that so?
Yeah. So this is why Gubbins worked quite closely with Marion Gamwell, the head of them, and so on. They had actually served in the First World War.
Yes.
They were set up. They were horseback,
World War.
first aid,
WAFs
nursing,
as well,
yeomanry. The WAFs are part of the British Armed Forces.
Yes, but lots of agents were WAFs.
They were, but they were also transferred. If they could go into bear arms, they could be in the WAF as well, but they're sent through the fanny so that they could done. And they also hoped that this would give them some protection under the Geneva Convention. So if they're caught, the Geneva Convention is primarily to protect prisoners of war, and of course it was never anticipated that women might be prisoners of war, so they were kind of not getting those protections. But if they had a uniform, fanny uniform would work.
And not all, I mean, they are of a certain background, aren't they, most of these women, but not all, by any stretch of imagination.
Wait, are we talking about the agents or the fannies in general?
Talking about both, really.
Well, you're right on both. The fannies tend to be quite upper class, husbands in the officers sort of thing, because these are the people who've got the leisure time to go and volunteer their services for this sort of thing. But
have the horses, in the
First World War, not in the Second World War, they've moved on.
Yeah, of course.
But yes, the diversity of the agents is extraordinary.
Yeah.
So we have about 75 women from 13 different nations.
Yeah, that's impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, they've got quite a lot in common. They're all very courageous, absolutely, and they're all deeply committed to the Allied cause. They would try and filter out anyone who was sort of there for heroics. That's not what they were after. And of course, they all had an intimate knowledge of the country they were going to be sent to, the occupied country they were to serve in, and the language spoken there, otherwise no good at all. But actually, they had very little else in common. So they were from all different faiths and none. For example, Norin Khan, Moscow-born daughter of an India Sufi Muslim.
Her background is extraordinary.
Yeah. Krystyna Skarbek, she was a Polish countess, and she was Jewish heritage from her mother's side. And they had working women like Violette Szabo, who was half French, half British. She was a shop assistant from Stockwell.
Yeah, she's not posh at all, is she?
She's very working class girl.
Round the corner from where we are now at Goalhanger headquarters.
She used to work at Bon Marché down the road. Yeah, right. That's right. So actually on the same road.
Right, amazing.
So these women, they were all different ages.
Among them is Virginia Hall with her prosthetic leg. She's someone straight out of a Spirit of the Age novel about the 1930s, isn't it?
Yeah, we definitely need to talk more about Virginia later on.
Again, we'll get to her with her wooden leg from a shooting accident. I mean, it's all, she's
absolutely tough.
Yeah, pre-war shooting accident.
Yeah, pre-war shooting accident, yeah. Well, right at the start, we talked about sort of the romantic interpretation of all this. Yeah. They're not all beautiful, are they?
No, exactly.
They're not all glamorous.
Thank you. Yes, and in fact, it could be a disadvantage if you were beautiful, because that makes your face more memorable. Anything like that is unhelpful. Violette Szabo is very beautiful. Krystyna Skarbek was actually a beauty queen before the war, although someone said she could turn it on and off. She could disappear into a crowd as well. Cicely Lefort, for example, was told on the aircraft on the way out, she could hear, they hadn't shut the intercom between the pilot and the navigator, and she heard them say that she looked like, she was very plain, and she looked like the wife of a vicar, Cicely Lefort. So she was, not great as she's going in. But, I think despite popular perception, it's not only possible, but it is preferable for them to be plain. It was more useful in the field.
So they can vanish.
She went out and did great service. Well,
but
sadly, sacrificed her life.
Did they?
Not all of them, no. I mean, like I said, very diverse, all ages, all, mothers, sisters, grandmother, all sorts. The point is, what they're looking for is not a specific age, gender. They're looking for a skill set. And if you pass the training, it doesn't really matter anything else because the diversity of the population out there.
And 75 women, pretty much, as far as we know. There's still some grey area, right?
There is at least one woman who hasn't been talked about, who isn't on most of the memorials, is on some, Sonia Oshanelsky, and I'd like to talk about her later. So there's some sort of disputed area. Right. It's to do with, there are some men and women who were recruited in the field. Yeah. Some of them had their ID papers sent over. Some of them came over themselves and then officially recruited in. Yeah. Some of them died before they could be recruited in, and then are they or are they not SOE? It's that sort of a thing. So yes, it's a disputed, the exact number, even today.
Even today? I
would argue that someone should be part of it, so we'll talk about how.
Even with quite a small number of people. I mean, we're not talking about an infantry division here. It's a small group of people, and even then it's quite hard to define. And that's quite interesting.
Yes.
But that's this nature of this world, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly, I suppose. But I do think more work needs to be done here, and I think we should be more inclusive about some of these people, especially those who sacrifice their lives, like Sonia Oshanelsky.
So is there a stand? I mean, we all know they have to do the same training, but is there a standard route?
Pretty much that's the intro, 2 to 3 weeks assessment training at Wanborough, which is a manor near Guildford. And then they go on to sort of paramilitary training up in the Highlands. So it's the same, the women had the same cold dawns, the same aching muscles and muddy fields. They had to get through that. They did fieldcraft, navigation, living off the land, those things you were talking about earlier, Al. Weapons training, explosives. They were told they had to be as familiar with plastic explosives as they were with butter. And then on to armed combat and then silent killing, which some of the women did put into good effect, and we can talk about that later. This is the bit they couldn't show on that TV training programme. They didn't show that. So that's killing just with a knife.
Because there's a story, isn't there, about, I think it's a couple of Lithuanian guys who go on this training course, and they go into Glasgow at the weekend for a drink, and they kill some people in a bar fight.
Okay, I haven't actually heard that.
I can't remember where I read it. Basically, they've been taught how to kill, in unarmed combat. So they go into the city and put it to the test at the weekend and kill a couple of people in a pub fight.
Oh, for goodness sake. I hadn't heard that. But Nancy Wake, one of the women, she later, post-war, she survived, and she testified that later they were doing an operation, a sabotage operation, and a German guard saw what was going on. So she went round behind and did a karate chop to the neck, and she killed him. And then she said, I was just amazed. Because she hadn't gone to a pub with the Lithuanians and tested it out on a civilian. She actually just deployed it in the field and it worked. So, yeah.
Blimey. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take a break while we're considering karate chopping random people. Maybe the
Not
person,
so random.
The person made this coffee. And we'll be back after the break.
Knife to the kidney, that's the best.
Is it knife to the kidney?
Apparently the pain is so intense that you literally can't speak. So you just die instantly.
Okay, maybe less tips.
We'll see you in a second. Welcome back to Weird Ways of Making You Talk. I've just pulled the knife out of my kidney. I'm here with James Holland.
I don't think you'd be able to do that, mate. You'd be dead.
You're a goner, aren't you? Before we get into the deployment, when you read about this, and when you're thinking about this, Claire, I think this is a question we've asked ourselves in all the stuff we've looked at.
What if it was me?
What if it was me? Would you be able to endure this training? Because the physical side of it's really, it's proper. It's
I think you'd be really resourceful.
Thank you. I think I'd be resourceful, but I think I'd probably work at Bletchley or somewhere because I have no sense of direction at all and I'm terrible at languages. So I've got a get-out clause. I would want to serve, absolutely, but I think I'd be more useful in other roles. And yeah, am I courageous enough? I don't know. We don't know until we're tested, do we? We'd all like to imagine we were, but
because it's interesting,
I really admire these women. I don't assume I have that level of courage.
Because they're selected for the courage, but again, as you say, you never really know until you know.
Partly for their courage, always for their language skills as well, so I'm out.
Because I look at, you look at the training they're doing, and it's basically the same as the commando course, isn't it? Sort of parallel to that, isn't it?
It is. Just very briefly on the whole point about courage, because I think there's two types of courage, or there are different requirements of courage. So you obviously need nerves of steel to go into battle with bullets flying all over the place. But there is a kind of an adrenaline-fueled kind of, you're nervous before the whistle goes or whatever, or the big bang starts. But then when you're in the middle of it, you're so consumed by the kind of the moment that it's still terrifying. Don't get me wrong, the heartbeat's absolutely racing, all the rest of it. But it's a very kind of sort of immediate thing. The thing about being a spy is you've got sustained tension.
Yeah.
And that's a completely different type of fear that you've got to manage. It's quite a different thing.
Yeah, spy, SOE agent. Yeah, exactly. So Selwyn Jepson, one of the main recruiting officers for SOE, he said that the women had, I love the phrase, a cool and lonely courage, which is about sustaining it long term.
Yes.
But he said that specifically for the women, and that's, why
Cool
part of what he was looking
courage.
for. But of course, the men had to have the cool and lonely courage if they're working in the field as a special agent as well. That's not actually gender specific.
No,
but it's a very good phrase. It's a very good phrase to describe that type of courage.
It is a requirement.
Well, and it's not because the battlefield courage is you, and maybe you're fighting for your mates, maybe you're looking out for one another. Yes, every man's alone in a foxhole, as it were. But,
you do find that SOE attracts the mavericks, if you like. So Francis Commerce, leading like in the SOE section, French section. And by the way, Michael Morpurgo's uncle, whose life Krystyna saved, he was a pacifist. He was down as conscientious objector until 42. And it was only then. He didn't want to be taking blind orders. It's that sort of very independent thinker.
Yeah.
That is good in the field as well. So,
but in the field, it's not like there's a whole group of you and you're all pulling together and going up to that hilltop with each other. You're on your own, and who do you trust, and
absolutely.
all those sort of questions, which are absolutely everyone you speak to. who do you trust? I mean, it's extraordinary. Anyway, so deployment. So SOE F section, which is France, fortunately, for those who can't keep up, they send roughly 300 men. And roughly 39 women. Of course, it's all secret, so it's all vague. Behind enemy lines. And of those, 91 men don't return.
So basically it's a third.
And 13 women.
And 13 women don't return. So it's kind of a one-third.
The women were told, just before they were deployed, they were given an option to not go honourably. And they were told they had a 50-50 chance of survival. But actually, 2/3 came back. Well, still 1/3 lost. Maybe it was more like a quarter lost.
It's not great odds, though, is it? Even if a third.
No, it's not fantastic. And how are they getting to France?
A whole variety of ways. So a large number of them parachuted after their parachute training. Not all of them were considered suitable for parachuting, like Nor. So they were taken in by Lysander, which is a light reconnaissance aircraft, or by Hudson light bomber. Some were brought in by ship to the coast of France, or even submarines. So a whole variety of ways.
What are they using women for? What role in particular?
They were specifically, at the start, recruited to be couriers, which was, they couldn't have operated. The day-to-day running of the SOE resistance back groups couldn't have operated without that contact between groups. But soon they were so successful that they were also being sent in, from 1943 certainly, as wireless transmitters, which is possibly the most dangerous role. Because, of course, they had to carry their wireless transmitter. It's not an iPhone. It's in a suitcase, battered old suitcase they'd send in, full of this very heavy equipment that they would have to carry around, making it look light. Then you have to rig up your aerial, possibly in a tree or whatever, very obvious. And the Germans, of course...
Or a garret in Paris or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they would do things like put it to the toilet cistern, just metal, to get some sort of better
And what are they transmitting and how often?
So they're transmitting
Morse,
messages. It's Morse, so they're all trained in Morse, but also it's encoded. The idea is that the SOE brought people, they brought arms and weapons, supplies, all organised through radio transmissions. They brought morale, they brought communications. Communications is key because... if you are a small resistance group and, like you say, you can't trust anyone, what can you do except for respond to the local situation? If you can contact each other via London, so you're not compromising security, you can have a national strategy. You can have a proactive plan of resistance, which makes all of the difference.
And this is all Jean Moulin's vision, isn't it?
Partly. Partly Jean Moulin, who's with RF section, the de Gaulle section, but partly, yes. It's SOE being proactive in this. So really vital work. So women are doing that.
Message drops... It's messages about weapons drops. There's going to be a thing happening the weekend after next. And are they also reporting on troop movements and stuff they've seen?
Yeah, they're doing all of that as well. I mean, it's largely SOE. I mean, that's more SIS, but yes, they do, of course, have an intelligence role as well. But yes, it's arranging supply drops largely, but sabotage, but coordination between resistance groups. And as we move towards D-Day, of course, it becomes hugely important. They play a very key role, blocking certain routes, getting rid of certain trains, keeping other routes open and so on. So it's very coordinated strategy.
But in terms of SOE in France, I mean, 1943 is their kind of annus horribilis, isn't it? Because that's where where the Prosper Circuit gets blown and... someone like Noreen Khan could walk straight into that, doesn't she?
Yeah.
Well, so let's go back. Let's go back to May 1941. Is this the first woman deployed?
The first woman deployed, she was actually from Chile, Juliana Balmaceda. Yeah, she was the first female SOE agent.
From Chile? I mean, how did she end up over here?
She'd been living in France and she'd married a British man, Victor Gerson, so Juliana Gerson, she's also known as. And as with a lot of the F-section agents, after the fall of France, they managed to get out. They got to Britain and, of course, had all the knowledge and the language and so on. And they both joined SOE when it was set up. And Victor, her husband, he proposed how useful it would be to have what he called an exfiltration or an infiltration route. So it's not exactly an escape line because it's not particularly for prisoners of war, but it is to get people in and out of the country, agents and so on. But he sent in, or Juliana volunteered to go in first before he did because she's got a Chilean passport. Yeah. So she can actually travel. Yeah. So she went into France ostensibly on a 3 weeks holiday. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
That's amazing. Why are you here? Oh, just on holes.
Yeah, where should we go for holiday this summer, dear?
I
thought Vichy France would suit me.
But of course, what she's doing is collecting all the timetables and the information on the curfews and stealing identity papers and ration cards and all of this sort of thing. And then she brought all of this information back to Britain, so then they could coordinate and then they sent.
How did she get back? Just came back from a holiday?
Well, she went over Spain and via Gibraltar, actually, so it's more of a classic SOE route. But yeah, and Victor went in 1942. 1942, the next year, taken in by submarine and set up one of the first infiltration-exfiltration lines using all of this information. He called it the Vic route, not the Jill route.
And she survived?
Yes, she survived, yeah.
And then the next year, in August, you've Yvonne Roudelat.
Yes.
Yeah. She's the first trained SOE agent to go in, so less of a spontaneous thing. I should say that Virginia Hall is already out there, but she's already in France, so she's not sent in that way. So, Yvonne is the one that was recruited by Selwyn Jepson when she was serving him a drink in the Eagle Quarter Town. Yeah. She is sent in and she serves as a courier for the very large Prosper network for almost a year. But a year after, then she was sent with Pierre Corleone to collect 2 Canadian agents, and the Canadian agents were stopped at a roadblock. Yvonne and Pierre had driven through fine. Their papers were accepted, but they waited for the Canadians. And when it was clear that there was trouble, Pierre and Yvonne drove off, but it was too late then, and there was a gunfight. They were fired at, and tragically, Yvonne was hit in the head by a bullet. Windscreen was smashed. And at this point, Pierre thought she was dead and thought the best thing to do was to kill himself so he wouldn't break under interrogation. So he just drove into a wall. Sadly, he didn't kill himself. His only wound was a bullet to the leg, actually. And they were both captured. Yvonne Roudelat was, very badly injured. She was sent to hospital, actually saved her life. But from then on, she was sent to prison and interrogated. But she didn't talk. We don't know if it was because her injury was so severe, she wasn't unable to, or she was using that, if she had a bit more consciousness and was using that deliberately. But anyhow, she never gave any information away and was eventually sent just to Ravensbrück and then on to Bergen-Belsen. And she did survive the war, but very sadly, just for a few days, she contracted typhus and she died just after.
Typhus outbreak that followed the liberation of the camp.
Exactly that.
Gosh.
That gives you an example of the peril these women were in.
Why are they being kept alive? We're past where the commando befehl has happened long before this. The idea that commando soldiers will be killed. Regardless, and people have been watching Rogue Heroes. It's a feature of one of the episodes, the Commando Befehl, which I think is quite interesting. People now know about that via a TV programme. But why are they being kept alive? What's going on?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. So partly they want information. They want to know, they know SOE exists. They actually got quite a lot of information over time. So they want information. And the more, even if it's just minor details, if you can say that to the next agent who you capture, then it looks like they know much more than perhaps they do, and it will break their resolve, so they might talk a bit more. So all of that is useful. So it's partly info.
And are they bugging them like Latimer House? Is the Germans doing that?
It's more brutal interrogation.
Right.
But also, especially with wireless transmitters, once they capture a wireless set, they want to know what the codes are and how they can then play a sort of cat and mouse, play back to Britain, get supplies sent that they can then pick up, divert British resources, possibly collect more agents and so on. So, it could be very useful for them.
Right.
But of course, they don't keep them all alive all the time. They kill them as well.
Called Lise Graff. She was working for the OSS, rather. She was recruited by the OSS. Version. But she ended up in the adjacent prison cell in Karlsruhe prison to Violet Szabo. And it was very interesting because she was obviously interrogated, but she was never tortured. And her point was not everyone was tortured. I mean, it rather depended on who you got. And people had different techniques.
And partly their attitude, partly Nora Inyak Khan was treated so badly because she refused not to promise to escape again. So she was given dangerous prisoner statement, and after that it all went horrendously south. So
Well, we've called this Krystyna & Co. this series, so let's talk about Krystyna Skarbek. We've started off with her banging on the door at SIS, going back to Poland, skiing in and out of Poland. So what does she do next?
I think we do need to. Yeah, the appetizer. Amazing achievements, and she's a really good example of how much the women achieved. So we need to mention before we leave her work in Eastern Europe, and she did work in 3 different theatres of the war. This was the first one. But one of the things, most important thing she did was she was a courier with a very specific piece of microfilm, which she got across several wartime borders. And I can't do the whole story because we wouldn't have time, but great peril and drama, and eventually got to Sir Aidan Crawley. And he managed to get it straight to Churchill. And what it showed was absolutely extraordinary. It was taken by Polish resistance, and she had brought it out. And it showed the massing of tanks and troops on what was then the German side of the German-Soviet border, and the creation of a series of fuel and ammunition dumps, clearly to support a land-based invasionary army. So this is the first film evidence
of Barbarossa.
Barbarossa, yeah, exactly.
Amazing.
And of course, Churchill didn't take it point blank. He checked with his ultra sources over Bletchley Park.
Corroborated by ultra.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then he got in touch with Stalin, who actually didn't believe him, thought he was just trying to drive a wedge between them. But it shows the value of the information that Krystyna Skarbek is taking across borders.
That's absolutely amazing.
And, at this point, Churchill, or his daughter later said that Churchill said, this agent who's brought this out, this is my favourite spy. So, in 41 at least, Krystyna Skarbek was Churchill's favourite spy. But, that's just the start of her achievements. So probably can't do the lot, but she went on to serve in, she's at that point, her cover is blown. So she's travelling with Andrew Kaversky with the wooden leg. They get across a series of further borders with great danger. They're nearly bombed in Istanbul. Eventually, there's a wonderful photograph of her sitting on the beach, twirling her sunglasses in Palestine. It looks like she's on holiday. It should say Paris Match in the corner of the photo, But actually, she's moving through these countries, sometimes just weeks, and on one occasion 2 days before they fall to the Axis. And eventually they arrive at the safety of the British base in Cairo, where she's really appalled because they're both put on ice. They're put into isolation and they're questioned. And it turns out the British are investigating reports that she might be a German double agent.
Well, if you can cross all those borders, it might lead to a lot of suspicion.
That was one of the reasons.
How is she able to do this?
And it wasn't with ease. I haven't done it all, but nonetheless, they had achieved that. And it was only after June 41, when Barbarossa happened, that it became clear that she wouldn't have voluntarily been handing over that information, and they were put back into active service. God. So, served largely in intelligence gathering in Egypt and a bit of active service in Syria, but then becomes the only woman to be parachuted in the summer of 44 from North Africa into France to
amazing.
Support D-Day in the south. So, and this is, again, one of her, many of her key achievements. It's really her service in France that makes her legendary in SOE. So she was sent in to be a courier for Francis Commerce, who I mentioned earlier, and his jockey circuit down in the south.
Yes, I remember bumping into an amazing lady. He was a French resistor. And she crossed paths with her there. Yeah,
so she was there as a courier, also wireless transmitter, although I looked at her speeds on wireless transmitting. I had a friend who worked at Bletchley and she said, speeds were not very good, dear. So that was her kind of support secondary role. She was really there as a courier, but she stepped up to the mark and did much more than that. She was in the Battle of Vercors, very tragic event. She was involved in coordinating supply drops and sabotage of German trains, etc. But her key achievements is she independently went up into the mountains, into the Alps, and established the first contact between the Italian resistance and the French partisans on the other side of the Alps. She heard a gun battle. She managed to work out what was going, circled around, and got in touch with the Italian partisan leader. Incredible. And she noted his need. His name was Giordano, and she noted down his need. And we've got the bit of paper in the Little Heart Military Archive. He's asking urgently for ammunition, shoes, uniformed, and packed meat. That's what these men were after.
I need
That's
meat.
what you need, obviously, a bit of meat.
Yeah,
so that was key. And then while she's in the mountains, she learnt that the Germans had a number of Polish conscripts, often men taken under duress, threats to their families. Of course, Poland had been invaded throughout history, and some of them had Germanic heritage and they were brought in, And she thought, right, I'm Polish. I'm going to go and talk to them. So on her own, she climbed up the mountain with a loud halo. It's going to give it away a bit, right? And a red and white headscarf, which of course are the colours of Poland. She got up to the top. She circled around to make sure that it was not the German leadership, but just the Poles who were on lookout, whatever. And then she called to them. And when she had got their attention and they didn't get their guns out immediately, she came out of the forest. And she spent a long time arguing with them and telling them what to do. And eventually they agreed that on a set date, I think it was the next week, that they would defect. They would come down from the mountain. They'd take all of the small arms they could carry. They would pull out the pins and so on to immobilise the bigger guns that they couldn't take with them, and leave the garrison on this very strategic pass in the Alps, the Col de l'Arche Pass, vulnerable. So that's what she did. A week later, they did it exactly as she organised. The men went up to officially take the surrender.
Yeah, of course.
But it was recognised. If you look in the papers, Francis Commerce, her circuit leader, said it was her own personal efforts that achieved the complete surrender of the L'Arche garrison, including persuading the Polish troops to steal all the arms and hand them over to us. And General Stawell, in his citation for her, because she was given honours for this, said it was nothing short of remarkable and of the greatest value to the Allied cause. And then
she's an absolute superstar, isn't she?
If that's not enough, she comes down from the mountain. She finds that Francis Commerz and 2 other guys have been arrested by the Germans. She begged the French resistance circuit she's working with to go and rescue them, but they refuse, I think rightly, because, we're very close to D-Day in the South, and they can't risk the men, the arms that they've had sent in at great peril. So she just gets on a bicycle, cycles over to the prison, and secures the release of all 3 men on her own with this incredibly perilous game of bluff. Yeah. Absolutely extraordinary. So,
amazing.
Basically talks their way out of prison for them.
She does.
It's extraordinary.
She terrifies the men. There's a report that the German Gestapo officer starts off pointing his revolver at her, and by the end of the conversation, his hand's shaking so much his coffee spills in the saucer, and she gets all 3 men released. So,
I refer you back to the little pencil note in the margin.
Exactly.
About how terrifying she was.
So, it's all in my book, guys. Mess. The Spy Who Loved.
What's the name of this book?
The Spy Who Loved, yeah.
As in
loved
miss.
freedom,
yes,
above all.
Yeah.
You don't mess with Krystyna.
These people they're boggling, aren't they?
Yeah, amazing. Absolutely incredible.
Initiative, leadership, sheer force of personality.
Unbelievable charisma.
Charisma, all these things.
Ingenuity, creative thinking.
Yeah. Everything all at once. In a way, it's sort of, I don't know how to put this, a credit to the system that they were able to actually able to find these people, actually able to encourage them, actually able to give a free rein. That by 1944, we aren't anymore in these poor little women can't be sent anywhere dangerous phase anymore, are we?
Well, a lot of people still think that. Not very many people know these women are doing this.
Yeah.
It's all kept very hush-hush. So general perception is exactly that. But those in the know how useful they are, and they're sending more and more women out. So, yeah.
Goodness. Well, her story is absolutely extraordinary. Again, that these people come forward is amazing too, isn't it? However, we've come to the end of this episode, but we're going to save Krystyna's fate until episode 2 of this series of Krystyna & Co. And we've been talking to Clare Mulley, and this is, it's mind-blowing, isn't it, Jim?
Yeah, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
Not one of these people's wearing khaki either, which is very unusual for us.
There is that as well.
We will see you for our next episode. Thanks very much for listening. Cheerio.